What we have here is a degree which I've been authorized to present, University of Berkshire Hathaway, bestows an honorary PhD to this phenomenally hardworking dealmaker, Ron Allen in this case, in appreciation for your insights and advice in the Clayton Homes acquisition, awarded on this day, October 14th, by the dean over here. And on the other side, it has a share of B stock that will go to Ron Allen as part of this graduation ceremony. Ron, you're the first awardee here of
Thank you very much.
Okay, this side's more valuable than that side, actually.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Clayton Family Foundation and by Clayton Homes, building affordable homes for families and individuals throughout the United States.
The University of Tennessee College of Business Administration is proud of its association with Warren Buffett. Since 1999, our finance students have made an annual trip to Omaha, Nebraska, led by Professor Al Alksher, to meet with and learn from the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett. During their February 2003 visit, the students presented Mr. Buffett with a gift that triggered the events leading to Berkshire Hathaway's purchase of Knoxville-based Clayton Homes, a leader in the manufactured housing industry. But Mr. Buffett tells the story best.
You know, it's really rather remarkable. I'm not sure there's ever been any acquisition in history that had quite this background. The students came up in the earlier years, and they would bring a football or a basketball, and then this particular crop from last year, or early this year, came and they did bring the book about Jim Clayton and by Jim Clayton, and that turned into a $1.7 billion deal.
To show his appreciation to those University of Tennessee students and faculty, Mr. Buffett honored the college in the fall of 2003 with an on-campus visit to speak with both MBA and finance students at the college's annual MBA symposium. While on campus, he surprised those who visited him in February with a generous gift of stock in Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett, who is recognized as the second wealthiest individual in the world, is respected and admired in part because of his common sense and straightforward approach to investing, which you will better understand and appreciate after watching this video. Please join us in watching and learning from Warren Buffett as he answers students' questions and shares with our students and faculty his investment philosophy and wealth of experience.
Mr. Buffett, what were your biggest investment mistakes, and what lessons did you learn from those that you can share with us?
Yeah, the biggest investment mistakes have been mistakes of omission rather than commission. I mean, you see in our balance or in our income statement the mistakes that result from commission, but accounting doesn't pick up the mistakes of omission, and they're the huge ones, and nobody knows about it unless I feel in the mood to confess, which I don't often, but since you asked. I would say the biggest mistake, I've named a couple in the past. I used to always name the Fannie Mae stock we didn't purchase in the early 80s. Now, I don't count as a mistake not buying Microsoft, for example. I met Bill Gates on July 5th, 1991. He spent about 10 hours explaining Microsoft to me. He did it with an orangutan the next day. He said that was easier, but it was fascinating to me, and I knew he was a terrific guy and a terrific manager, and Microsoft was a terrific company. So I went back and bought 100 shares just to keep track of it. But I didn't know enough to make the decision. I really didn't know what other people were doing in the field, and so it was outside of what I call my circle of competence. And the important thing in investing is not how big your circle is; it's knowing where the perimeter is, so that you stay within the circle. And we try to do that. Now, Fannie Mae was in my circle of competence in the early 1980s. So when I miss something like that, I deserve a thumb-sucking award, basically. If I miss, all kinds of other things, that doesn't really make any difference. But I missed that one. That costs billions of dollars, never shows up in our financial statements. An example I use more often now, more recent, was I set out, this is even worse, I set out to buy 100 million shares pre-split, 200 million shares of the present stock, of Walmart about 5 or 6 years ago. It was at $23 a share, so it would have cost us $2.3 billion if we'd bought it. If we had bought it, it would be worth about 11.5 or 12 billion. Now, I knew enough to understand Walmart. I mean, I knew it was the retailing machine of all time. And what happened on that was I bought a few million shares, and then it went up. It probably went up to 23 1/8. Now, when a stock goes from 23 to 23 1/8, I mean, that's a major event around Berkshire. I mean, I have trouble adjusting. I mean, my license plate says thrifty, and the guy who designed it knew what he was saying. And so, like a dope, I just said, well, I'll wait till it gets back to where I was buying. It was a little more than 1/8, but nevertheless, and of course, I missed out on 8 or 9 billion. So that's a mistake. Now that you're a B shareholder, I mean, don't raise hell about this at the meeting, but but those are the mistakes you don't see. Mistakes that you can see is Berkshire Hathaway, literally, today, is a merger of 3 companies in my business lifetime. There was the original Berkshire Hathaway, which we bought into in 1965, or bought control of in early 1965. And then there were 2 other companies called Blue Chip Stamps, a trading stamp company in California, and Diversified Retailing, a company that started out with a department store in Baltimore. The Diversified and Blue Chip got merged into Berkshire, so that's where it all comes from. All 3 of those were mistakes. I mean, starting with the textile business, Berkshire was a textile company with 20 million in net worth. The whole 20 million was tied up in the textile business, and it was a lousy business. I bought it because it was cheap, not because it was good. And that's a mistake. It took me a long time to get over that. I learned under a fellow who was a magnificent human being, magnificent teacher, and did all kinds of things for me. He put the emphasis on buying things that were quantitatively cheap. That was the background from the 30s and 40s. I call it the used cigar butt approach to investing. I mean, you go around, you walk down the street, and you see a cigar butt, and it's kind of soggy and disgusting and repels you, but it's free. And there may be 1 puff left in it. So you think, what can I lose? I mean, so you pick it up and you see, and maybe there's 1 puff in it, but it didn't cost you anything. So if it isn't, all you've had is a soggy cigar butt in your mouth. And that was Berkshire Hathaway back in 1965. It was the wrong kind of business to buy. It had actually lost significant money over the previous 10 years, but it was very cheap. So I bought in, and then all of a sudden I owned a textile business, a New England textile business. A New England textile business in New Bedford, Mass, where about 100 textile companies had gone out of business, and we were the last ones really foolish enough to be trying to make a profit. So it was a terrible base to build what has become Berkshire Hathaway on. I mean, we sat with that 20 million, which was originally 100% of our capital. We sat with that for about 20 years trying to make it work, and it never worked. So if I'd done the things that subsequently we did in insurance and See's Candy and all kinds of other businesses, and done it from scratch and not put them in Berkshire, maybe Gates would have to move over. Diversified Retailing, we went into Baltimore, bought a department store in 1966. We thought we were buying a 2nd-class department store at a 3rd-class price. We were buying a 4th-class department store at a 3rd-class price, and that sunk in after a few years, but that was a mistake. Blue Chip Stamps was a trading stamp company, and most of you are too young to remember, but in the 60s, particularly, there was this huge rage, and S&H was a huge company, and Blue Chip was set up in California, and literally it did 120 million of business in 1967 or 8 when we bought it. It now does about $50,000 a year. So it's under our careful management, lots of effort. We've taken it from 120 million of sales down to about 50,000, and we'll get the rest of the way before long. It was that we bought into a hula hoop, and we didn't know it at the time. So with that great background, all 3 were mistakes. Now, we put them all together. 3 mistakes put together, 1 each, becomes 3 mistakes in 1 pile. But we did go into these other businesses. I learned after a point that the real thing in in business is to be in good businesses with good people. And that's what works. And it's much more important than trying to buy something cheap, which doesn't, it may work okay occasionally, but it's no way to build a business over time. So those three were mistakes of commission. Even more, the Walmarts and the Fannie Mae's are omission. And we'll have new ones next year. You know, I will have a section in the report this year called The Dumbest Thing I Did This Year. It may take half the report, you know, I mean, who knows? But it's, I don't dwell on them in the least. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, I've been having fun the whole time, and I'll continue to have fun. And actually, you know, if you played golf and you scored a hole-in-one on every hole, it wouldn't be an interesting game after a while. I mean, if it had some magnet in the hole someplace and the ball automatically went to it, you'd give up golf. It's much more fun to play the game, par threes, par fives, occasionally hit one in the rough, and so on. It's a lot of fun. So that's as much as I wish to confess to today.
My name's August.
Good to see you.
Mr. Buffett, could you suggest some books or other resources that might prove beneficial for investment decisions that we make?
Yeah. By far the best book on investing, and it shaped my total investing framework, was one I read when I was 19. And it's called The Intelligent Investor. It came out when I was at the University of Nebraska in 1949. I had started investing when I was 11. I just dithered away until, 7, when I was 7 and 8 and 9. But so unfortunately, I didn't get started until I was 11. But I bought my first stock when I was 11, and then I experimented with a whole bunch of things, the timing of stocks and charting and doing all these crazy things. It was a lot of fun. Profitless, but a lot of fun. And I did that until I was 19. And I read all the books on investing in the public library, and just, I ate it up. And it was a lot, it was fascinating to me, but I had no framework. I was just searching for something. I was hoping that little things on a chart would tell me something about what a stock was going to do. I mean, it was kind of crazy, but everybody else was doing it, so I figured I'd do it too. Sometimes you'd turn the chart upside down, it still wouldn't help. And then in 1949, I read The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. I'd never heard of him up till then. And there are really only 2 chapters in that book that are the key to it. But they set my philosophical framework for investing in 3 ways. They're so basic and so simple that they're hard to, it's hard to understand how they could be that important. But the 10 Commandments are simple. The first is that a stock is part of a business. I mean, you can't think of a stock as something different. You value a business, and then you divide by the shares outstanding. But what you have to think about is what kind of a business are you getting into, what are its economic characteristics, who are its competitors, what's its management like, all of these things that relate to a business instead of a little ticker symbol. I used to know when I was 11 or 12 the ticker symbols of every company virtually on the New York Stock Exchange. I could mark the boards at Harris Upham, but I didn't know anything. I mean, I knew that X was U.S. Steel and T was AT&T and so on, but I didn't know anything. I didn't know what was behind them. So I had to start looking at these little symbols or these little names in the paper as businesses and decide, how do you value a business? What counts? The second thing in the book is that Graham gives you a marvelous set point in terms of how the investor should react to stock market fluctuations. He talks about his mythical Mr. Market in Chapter 8. And there's been no better thing written in terms of the investor's attitude toward stock prices. Most people react the wrong way to stock prices. I mean, they feel good when their stocks go up, they feel bad when they go down. They think the stock market is there to instruct them. And Mr. Market is this partner you have in investing. He's a remarkably obliging partner. I mean, this guy comes around every day and he tells you what he'll pay you for your interest in the business or what he'll sell you more at the same price. Nobody ever does that in private business. If you and I owned a gas station together, and I said, every day I want you to come in and offer me your half interest in the station, and I can either buy your half or sell you my half at the same price, and you have to come in every day and do it, you'd be at a terrible disadvantage. And you'd be at a particular disadvantage if you're Mr. Market in the market, because Mr. Market, our friend in the market, who obligingly gives you those figures every day, different figures at the end of the day and the start of the day, but he's naming a price at which he'll either buy or sell. The beautiful thing about him is that this guy is an alcoholic manic depressive. I mean, he is as unsound as they come. He wanders around all day, and looks at the crazy things, and He's going to name all kinds of crazy prices. And you don't have to pay any attention to them, except when it's to your advantage to do so. If that's once a year, if it's once every 5 years, it's one stock out of 3,000, all you have to do is sit there. You have no moral responsibility to this jerk. You know, I mean, he is naming these numbers. You didn't ask him to, but he's doing it. And all you have to do is pick the one time when he is particularly depressed or particularly manic or particularly drunk or whatever it may be. And the market will be all of those things. And you take advantage of it. And that's what's remarkable about stocks, if you think about it, is that if you look at the high and low on all of these American companies for the last year, you'll see case after case after case where the high is twice the low. Now that's for a sound American business, is running along, paying people, selling goods, and so on. If you go out and look at farmland 10 miles from here, there's no way in the world over a year that the farmland is going to range in value from X to 2X. It maybe go from X to 110% of X or vice versa. If you look at an apartment house near here and get figures on essentially apartment houses like that over a year, it won't move 10% in a given year. But here are the finest of American businesses, and people just name these numbers that go all over the place, and you don't have to play except when you want to. That's the important thing, and that's what Graham tells you. The market isn't there to instruct you, to tell you anything. The market is there just basically to serve you when you want it to serve you. You know, one of the most important things to remember in stocks, very hard to do, but people have all these feelings about them. The stock doesn't know you own it. You know, you're sitting there with these certificates for Berkshire. The company doesn't even know you own it, you know, and the stock doesn't. It's trading now, and they don't know you own it. So it has no feelings about you. I mean, you've got all these feelings about it, but it's just part of a business. If Berkshire is worth 75,000 times 1.5 million shares, you know, roughly 110 billion or something like that, it's a good investment. If it isn't, it's a lousy investment, you know, and you have to value the business. And Graham, you know, it's amazing, but people don't do that in Wall Street. You hear price targets or that kind of thing, but you'd see no one write a paper that says, here's the nature of this business over the next 20 years. You know, what should that business sell for? Forget about what it's selling for. In fact, one of the things I always like to do when I'm looking at investments is I like to look at them without knowing the price. Because if you see the price, it automatically has some influence on you. If you just sit down with the reports, if I get an idea about looking up a company and I get the 10Ks and so on, I would rather not know the price because I'd rather value it without knowing the price. When I used to handicap horses when I was a kid, one of the things I would do is I'd get the racing form ahead of time. And if there were 9 horses in a race, we'll say, obviously the probabilities of each one winning the race had to add up to 100%. I mean, one horse was going to win the race absent a dead heat or all of them dropping dead on the backstretch. So if you went through the racing form and I would look at the third race at Hialeah, I would try to figure out the percentage chance of each horse winning the race, and that had to add to 100%. Then I would compare those percentages to the odds. But first of all, I wouldn't look at the odds first. I would look at the past performance and all of that thing first. Stock market's the same way. Third thing in Graham's book is the margin of safety. If you come up to a bridge and it says capacity 10,000 pounds, and you're driving a 9,800-pound truck, you drive down further and find another bridge. I mean, you know, nobody knows exactly what that capacity is, and sign may have been put up 3 years ago. So you always leave a margin of safety. You don't try to cut things that close. You wait till something kind of shouts at you in the stock market. And with those 3 principles, you can build all kinds of structures on that. But that's the foundation. And if you've got that in mind, and that's in the Intelligent Investor, I've never found anything that remotely compares with it.
You've touched on this a little bit already, Mr. Buffett, but as a follower of Ben Graham, what one piece of Graham's advice would you say has had the most impact on you?
Well, all 3 of the ones I just named, in a sense, have had, I mean, you can't get rid of one leg of the 3-legged stool and still have a good investment philosophy. But I would say that the most important thing over a long period and working with big money is to understand the business. I mean, let's just say for the moment that you were given $1 million or whatever sum was necessary, and you could look around Knoxville or look around all of Tennessee if you want and buy into any three businesses, between now and a week from now, private businesses. So they're not trading or anything of the sort. And you've got a week to do it or you have to give the money back. Now, what will you be doing during the next week? I mean, you can look at all these companies. Some of them you're quite familiar with. Some of them you're less familiar with. Some of them you know by reputation. Some of them you know the management. Some of them you don't. You know their competitive situation. What will you be thinking about during that 7-day period? How will you actually be screening these companies out? I think you'll look for three businesses, and you can't trade them after you buy them. You're going to own them the rest of your life. You're going to be looking for three businesses. You're going to be looking for businesses that have enduring competitive advantage. You don't want to buy a Burger King franchise just because nobody's come within 10 miles of it yet, because Wendy's and McDonald's and all of those will be there pretty soon. I mean, it isn't necessarily who's earning the most money now. You're going to look for something with enduring competitive advantage. Now, that takes a business with some kind of a moat around it, because capitalism, by definition, is a system where every time somebody has an economic castle, somebody else is going to come after it. I mean, it's just the nature. If you open a restaurant and it's successful here in town, somebody's going to take your menu and probably take your chef, maybe cut your price, maybe offer a little more parking, maybe be a better okay, whatever. I mean, capitalism consists of going after the other guy's castle. Now, if that's the case, you want a castle with a big moat around it. And there's a lot of ways you can have a moat around something. You could have it by patent protection. You could have it by location in certain areas. I mean, if you have something in people's mind, like Coca-Cola, 6 billion people in the world, practically all of them have something in their mind about Coca-Cola, largely favorable. They don't have anything in their mind about RC Cola, And if RC Cola spent $1 billion advertising, they wouldn't have anything in their mind about RC Cola. But they've got something in their mind about Coke, and generally it's favorable. That's why Coke wants to be where people are happy, because they want to be at the theater, they want to be at Disney World, they want to be at the World Series. They want to always have you drinking that drink of Coca-Cola while at the same time experiencing happiness. And if they do that, they're going to sell a lot of Coca-Cola. And it won't make any difference if somebody is a half a cent less on some serving than Coke. So that's an enduring competitive advantage. And you want it run by honest and able people. You don't want to go in with a crook, and you don't want to go in with a dope. Now, the best businesses to buy are the ones where you could have a dope in there. I mean, Peter Lynch says, buy a business that's so good that an idiot can run it, because sooner or later one will. And there's some merit to that. In fact, I got a question the other day from a student group, and they said, what's going to happen to Berkshire when you go gaga? And I said, well, Berkshire's so good that I can go gaga. In fact, I may even be. Those are the kind of businesses to own. So you want a management that's able and honest, and then you want a price that's sensible. And that's what you'd look for. You'd go around Tennessee, got a week to do it, and you'd immediately screen out a whole bunch of things. You just know that they weren't a fertile area, And that's an important thing to be able to do, to know, just get rid of all kinds of things. There was a great article in the New Yorker 30 years ago when Bobby Fischer was playing Spassky in that famous chess match which drew attention around the world. And they examined how the mind could, with billions and billions and billions of possibilities, how it could group things so as to immediately cast it down to where you had like 4 options. And of course, when the humans play something like deep thought, or whatever the latest version is of the computer on that computer is making maybe 700,000 or 1 million calculations a second. And the human mind is competing against that, but the computer is checking every possibility. And the human mind somehow has this ability to cast out 99.999% of those things that the computer has to go through in order to focus on the 3 or 4 possibilities that really make sense. And investing's a lot like that. It's not that tough because there aren't that many companies, but you want to cast out all kinds of things. If somebody told me that my life depended on picking among the Dow Jones stocks a group of 10 that would be the best performers or outperform the index as a whole, I would spend my time thinking of the worst companies in there. I would cast out things, and then I would figure I'd left those behind, and I would. That's an easier way to approach the problem, actually, than trying to pick the 10 best. So you would have to, if you were thinking about the state of Tennessee, there's a whole lot of things you wouldn't examine. You just figure they're too tough. You might decide, car dealerships were too tough. It's always going to be competitive. Who knows whether Ford or General Motors are going to be selling more cars 5 years from now, or whether there's going to be tariffs on foreign cars, or who knows. So you just say, I'll give up on car dealers. I'll think about something else. And that approach that you use there is the same approach you really want to bring to the stock market. You've got 3,000 companies tonight you can look at on the New York Stock Exchange. There's a valuation on every one of them. It'll change tomorrow. You don't have to play. Once a year, if you have 5 good ideas in your lifetime, you get very rich. I tell students sometimes they'd be better off if they had a punch card when they got out of school with only 20 punches on it. Because then, instead of listening to somebody at a cocktail party and then going out the next morning and buying some shares, they'd really think about every punch. And that's all the punches you get. 20 punches is plenty. You just have to make sure that you don't do any of them for frivolous reasons. We never want to buy anything small at Berkshire. It just doesn't make any difference. We want to think about things that can move the needle. And that gets tougher as the capital gets greater. But that's the way to focus on investments. Who's next?
Mr. Buffett, how do you determine when to sell a stock? What factors do you consider?
Yeah, well, the question is about selling. And when I started in investments, when I entered Ben's class, I had about $9,800. And the whole problem then was I had way more ideas than money. I mean, I was looking for things. I was going through all the Moody's manuals and digging up ideas and stocks, all kinds of things that were cheap. But I still only had $9,800. So I would buy something, and then I would find something that looked even cheaper or better, and I would have to sell the first thing to buy the second thing. That was my state for a long time. Now, in the late 1960s, I wound up my partnership because I couldn't find things, but that's because the whole market had gone crazy. And at that time, I was working with about $100 million in the partnership when I wound up the partnership. But $100 million wasn't an unmanageable amount of money. It's just that the market itself was just offering nothing. And so I sent the money back to my partners. But as the years have gone by and the capital I'm working with has increased, there's fewer and fewer opportunities. So I never have to sell anything now to raise money to buy something else. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. I've got more money than ideas. And it'll probably stay that way. So I would say that when you're in a position with relatively little capital, you sell something when you find something that offers you more for your money, or about which you're sure. I mean, if two things are look equally cheap, but you feel one is you're 100% certain you really understand the business, and the other you got 80% certainty, you go with the one you're certain of. If you're in my position, you basically don't sell, or very seldom. Now, looking back, we should have sold some things when the bubble was on because the valuations got so high that even if we'd sold, they were good businesses, but they just were at ridiculous prices. So with hindsight, that would have been the thing to do. But I don't feel terrible about that because the money would have gone into cash and we might have bought them back cheaper, but we might not have. And generally speaking, if you've got a lot of capital, you're not going to find that many wonderful ideas. And if you look at the fortunes that are made in this country, generally they've been by owning a good business for a long period of time. I mean, that's not the worst thing in the world. And that's the way people who joined with me in the 50s and 60s, they held on, a number of them. And they might have danced around, and Berkshire was too high at certain times. They might have tried to sell it and buy it back, but usually that doesn't work very well. So I would say that if you lose confidence in the management or the business, you sell. I mean, there's no sense owning something where the competitive advantage is gone or where you think the management is bad news. You may wish to sell if the price gets too high, but that's more optional. The first two you should do. The third is somewhat optional. But if you're working with small sums of money, I was finding things initially that were selling at like 2 times earnings, good businesses. And so if I found something at 2 times earnings and I owned something at 3 times earnings, I sold the 3 times to buy the 2 times. Looking back, I should have borrowed a little money and kept both, but that wasn't my style.
Mr. Buffett, when trying to value a company, do you place greater emphasis on the PE ratio or the PEG, price earnings growth, or is there another metric you use to value a company?
The most important thing to learn is how to value a business. It's also the toughest to explain. I look for certain, you look for certain things that allows you to narrow it down, like I was saying about, the Spassky-Fisher situation. So if I'm a basketball coach, and I see a guy, I'm walking around the campus here, and I see somebody 7 feet tall, I'm interested. Now, he may not be coordinated. We may not be able to keep him in school. He may be robbing, stores at night or something. But he's still the right guy to be looking at. We can work with this guy. So I am interested in 7-footers, maybe 6'10". And if I see some guy that's 5'3", and he comes up to me, and he's dribbling away, and he's telling me, doing fancy moves, and he says, "Coach," I said, "I'm your guy." I say, "Yeah, but if you get in there against these 7-footers, I'm not sure he'll be dribbling exactly the same way. I'm going to skip him. He may be a wonderful prospect and all that, but I'm not interested. So I am looking for signals that tell me in investments what height and a few things might tell me if I was a basketball coach. In the end, what I'm going to buy is the business where I feel extremely certain about the competitive advantage, extremely certain about the integrity and ability of the management, and where I think the discounted flow of the cash that business will produce over time makes sense in relation to its current price. You really are looking for a business where you see the future. And that's why we don't get in tech. It isn't that I don't love the computer and think it's doing all kinds of things for society. I just don't know what it's going to look like in terms of who's going to be selling what to whom and at what prices and against whom and all of that sort of thing 10 years from now. Whereas I know that people are going to be chewing Wrigley's chewing gum in 10 years. People sitting in front of a computer chewing gum will not behave way differently than people chewing gum, in this audience as we talk. There are certain things that won't be affected. Gillette razor blades. That 70% of the value worldwide of razors and blades is Gillette. That's after almost 100 years of shaving, and everybody knows what a razor blade does. They all know how to buy the steel. They all know how to sell it through Walmart or whomever. But 70% of the world. Now, part of that's because men don't like to change as much. If a man gets happy with something, he doesn't fool around with it a lot. Women are a little more inclined to experiment. But for $25 a year, something you do every day, you get a wonderful experience with Gillette. What better is the world going to offer you? You're getting a claim currently about some 4-blade razor, but don't worry about that one. The 70%, just think of that. Coca-Cola, 19 billion cases of Coke. Not Coke, but Coke products sold a year. Everybody in the world drinking it. You think, will that change dramatically in the next 10 years? I bet my life against that. We sell See's candy in California. There's 35 million people in California. They did the right thing last Tuesday, incidentally. People ask how I got involved in the Schwarzenegger campaign. I won a look-alike contest. But here they are, 35 million people. Everybody in California has something in their mind about See's candy. What candies are in your mind? Number one candy bar, Snickers. Number one candy bar 10 years ago was Snickers. Number one candy bar 20 years ago was Snickers. People don't fool around with candy bars. You cannot come out with lots of new bars and intrigue people. It's not like, perfume or other things maybe where people experiment. If you go into the drugstore and you say, "I want a Snickers bar," and it's 60 cents, and the druggist says, "I've got something just as good for 55 cents called Joe Schmo's, caramel and nut bar," you're going to walk across the street. Now, when you walk across the street for a product, then you got a business. That is the test. And where a nickel doesn't make a difference. And so it's, there is no good way to compete with Snickers. You want something where price competition is not solely going to be the determining factor. And that's true of razor blades, it's true of Snickers, it's true of See's candy, it's true of Coca-Cola, and there's a lot of things of which it isn't true. That mode is what is differentiation of product, differentiation of service, differentiation of location, whatever it may be. And that's essential. Next. Hi.
Clayton Williams. Mr. Buffett, have the extensive technological changes in market mechanisms and the internet over the last 20 years caused a meaningful shift in investor psychology, or are investors still making basically the same mistakes?
No. Incidentally, I was just drinking some of this. If there's any in the audience, I don't care whether you drink it, but open the can, if you will. We get the profit on 1 out of every 12 of these, so. Now, I would say that the internet and the high-tech boom was an excuse for people to go crazy. But it did not, and people go crazy in markets occasionally. You can read, the South Sea bubble, you can read the tulip mania, you can go back and read. People go crazy periodically. And high IQ people go crazy. I mean, it's a fascinating sort of phenomenon to watch. And one of the things I did in school, I'd go back and read papers from all the earlier panics and booms and so on. It's just, people make the same mistakes over and over again. And they're enormously subject to a herd instinct. And they will go crazy, and it helps in going crazy to have some sort of an excuse. It sounds like it's different this time. But the truth is that if I've got $10 in my pocket that I received as a dividend from a business, it doesn't make any difference whether that came from Wrigley's Chewing Gum or from an internet company. I mean, the money spends the same. So the test of a business is not whether it does something glamorous, something new. It's how much cash it's going to produce over time. It's the only test. I mean, the reinvesting is laying out money to get more money later on. Why lay it out otherwise? And the money doesn't know where it comes from. Now, where it comes from may determine something about the enduring competitive advantage and all that sort of thing. But money made from an internet company is no different than money made, from a textile company or from a candy company or anything else. So the internet, anything new, it was uranium in the 50s, it was computer leasing in the late 60s. I mean, all kinds of things come along where rising prices coincide with glamour. And after a point, the rising prices themselves become the rationale for buying. People may dress it up in other forms in their mind, a little more respectable intellectually, but what they're really doing is they're just getting excited. And they will always get excited. I mean, greed and fear are the big things in markets. And you will see in your lifetime greed and fear at different points that equal anything you've seen in the past. The human race does not get smarter in that respect, and they won't. That's a cheerful message. I mean, I want you to understand, you will get a chance to profit from others' folly in a huge way, and the trick is to profit from it, not participate in it. The proper temperament is far more important in successful investing than points of intellect. I mean, if you've got a reasonable intellect and the right temperament, you'll get very rich. And if you've got the wrong temperament for it, you'll get done in at some point. Anything times 0 is 0. I mean, it's they found that out at long-term capital management, for example, in 1998. What happened, would happen very, very, very seldom, but it does happen. You had, where was the largest earthquake in the United States, continental United States, in our recorded history? It was in New Madrid, Missouri. Now nobody down at New Madrid is sitting there worrying about another 8.4 or something, but it was, it was an extraordinary event. In fact, there were 3 of them in about a 2-month period. The improbable happens, and in financial markets, the improbable happens far more often than people think by running statistical regressions and so on. 5 sigma events aren't 5 sigma events. And you just have to keep your sanity, basically. If you just always write down on a piece of paper, if you're buying stock in a company, whether it makes widgets or it's an internet company and it has 100 million shares out and it's selling at 10, you say, I am buying XYZ at $1 billion. You're buying the business because, and then just list down the reasons. And if more people did that, you won't have bubbles, but they won't do it. They'll give in exactly the same emotions that people have for centuries and centuries and centuries. And like I say, that's what makes incredible opportunities in the stock market. I mean, that's why stocks frequently have a high that's twice the low in a given year when everybody knows a business doesn't change in value like that except under unusual circumstances. Yep.
Mr. Buffett, I'm very interested in knowing what exactly the world's greatest investor does with his time. Specifically, could you walk us through a typical day in the life of Warren Buffett? And without revealing your bag of tricks, what sort of activities you might undertake to arrive at your investing ideas?
Yeah, it's going to be disappointing. I now spend at least 12 hours a week on the internet playing bridge. Yeah. This is part of my How to Get Rich course, the play bridge. And during the day, I read a lot of things. I talk to a few people on the phone. There are no meetings of any kind. We don't have any meetings. I mean, and we've had one time, I think I got the CEOs together 15 years ago and talk about something. But some of them have never been to Omaha. They've missed a lot, but what do they know? It would amaze you how little I do. And I don't want any lip now that you're one share shareholders of B. I read a lot of annual reports. I don't read as many as I used to. I read a lot of 10Ks, call up a few of them every day. I want to understand as many businesses as I can, but the nice thing about investing is that it's cumulative. I mean, everything I learned 30 or 40 years ago, it's stored up in my mind. You're learning all the time. That doesn't mean you learn about 100% of the companies or 90%, but what I learned about the oil business, what I learned about the real estate business, what I learned about the department store business, it's still there. And you keep accumulating a little more knowledge, and then every now and then you see something. You see one of those 7-footers walking by, and then you try to learn as much as you can about that specific operation, and then you have to act. Sometimes, I don't call the managers very often. They usually call me. I've got managers that call once a year. I've got one manager that I talk to virtually every night. I've got a few managers I talk to once a week. It's much more their personality. They run their businesses. They know their businesses. I don't go into those businesses to run them myself. We don't have anybody in headquarters to run them. So I'm counting on people who have built successful businesses over decades just to keep doing it, which isn't a very big assumption. And they do it. And some of them like to talk to me. Some of them apparently don't like to talk to me. I'm not hurt. And I'm not there late at night. I'm thinking about things all the time. But I'm normally in there at 8:30 or thereabouts and go on about 5. And probably if you put a stopwatch to me, I'd probably average an hour of that time to an hour and a half on the phone. And the rest of the time I'd be reading. One of the beauties about Berkshire, from my standpoint, is I got to create my own business. I mean, it was pretty much a blank slate when I got there. I had the textile business, but I got to paint a painting. Now, if you're going to get to paint your own painting, you really ought to paint something you're going to like when you get through. And I don't like meetings, and I don't like lots of, I don't like lots of process or that sort of thing. So I have painted Berkshire as a corporate painting that suits me. And it works well for me. It might not work for somebody else. I wouldn't be worth a darn in some organization where I had to go to a black tie event 5 times a week, and go to industry conferences and everything. I just wouldn't do it. I'd go back to delivering papers because it's more fun. And that's really the way I feel. So Berkshire is designed so that I can play a lot of bridge and read a lot of stuff. And I can't imagine enjoying life more, because if there was something else I'd enjoyed more, I'd be doing it. But that's a day at Berkshire. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Yeah. Hi.
Mr. Buffett, over a 40-year period, what would you expect the average normal U.S. stock market return to be?
40 years, huh? Well, I'll be around to give you that answer. Well, I would say that if you're in a period of those 40 years where inflation averages 2 or to 3%. You're in what I would call sort of normal. You don't have any huge aberrations in the world on a macro scale. And I would say that the average business will produce over that period something like 7%. But investors, that's what if nobody did anything. If we just all here sat and bought corporate America together, we bought every share, and we never traded with each other, our group, I think, would average something like 7% in that environment where nothing really dramatically changed. Now, because American investors have been taught to think they have to move around all the time, and you have to sell to the person next to you and they have to sell to somebody else, investors incur what I call frictional costs. You incur them when you buy a mutual fund, and there's a management fee, perhaps and a load and a 12B1 fee. You incur them when you buy stocks individually. There's all kinds of frictional costs in the system. Those frictional costs, probably for investors as a whole, come to something like 1% annually. You can keep them down yourself. The frictional cost of somebody who's owned Berkshire for 40 years has been virtually zilch. They paid a tiny commission one time, and management fees are low. So it doesn't have to be that way. But because stocks are looked at so much like being in a casino for so many people, the American public as a whole will incur these 1% frictional costs. So that 7%, if that happens to be the figure correctly, will turn into 6% for the American public as a whole, and 1% will dribble away to investment managers and brokers and people who sell advice and all kinds of frictional costs. When you think about it, that's a pretty hefty take. It's 1 out of 7. It'd be 14% of the returns from business. But that's my best guess as to what will happen. You can keep your own frictional costs down and let somebody else pay a lot more of the frictional costs. But if you're in an investment, if you're playing in an investment arena and you are incurring frictional costs of 2 or 3%, think of what the day traders were incurring, you know. But you are giving away an awful lot of the underlying business results that America will achieve. Because General Motors or Exxon, you know, American Telephone, how much they earn has got nothing to do with how much all their shareholders incur if they keep changing chairs all the time. Every time you change chairs with somebody in this room, if we own the whole place, you both pay something. If you just sit tight, the companies will make the money that they make, and that'll all belong to you. But if you move around a lot, it will belong to the people who either advise you to move around or shepherd you from one chair to another. Yep.
Mr. Buffett, what is your future outlook on the U.S. financial market and the health of global economy, especially China?
Future Western civilization. Well, over a long period of time, markets will behave pretty much like they've always behaved. Most of the time, they will be valuing businesses in a reasonable range, and they will go crazy periodically on the upside and downside. In 1974, they went totally crazy on the downside. I mean, you can't believe how cheap major businesses got in a period like 74. Businesses were doing fine. The Washington Post Company sold in the market the whole company for $80 million. It owned the Washington Post newspaper, it owned Newsweek, it owned 4 great big network television stations, including one in Washington, and one in Miami, one in Jacksonville, one in Hartford. It had half interest in Bowater Mercy paper, 800,000 acres of timberland. It had third interest in the International Herald Tribune. Didn't owe any money to speak of. $80 million. It's a joke. At that time, you could have announced that you were going to hold an auction of their properties in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at 2 in the morning, you know, and you would have had people show up who would have paid at least $500 million for those same properties. Now imagine buying $500 million worth of properties, good businesses, for $80 million. You know, in this world, all these people with high IQs around studying finance at major business schools, all kinds of things, 1/5 or 1/6 what the business is worth. The Graham family was obviously both honest and talented. They were in good businesses. Well, that company today, they haven't discovered oil. They've got pretty much the same businesses. You know, it's now selling for $7 billion or thereabouts. But there's nothing magic. They haven't discovered anything. You know, it was a $500 million business that became a $7 billion business over a 30-year period with good management and decent properties and all of that. And you could have bought it for $80 million. You know, we own at Berkshire some Washington Post stock that we paid $10 million, a little less than $10 million for, and which is now worth $1.2 billion or something of the sort. And it was nothing esoteric about it at all. It's just people go crazy. And if you ask me about the financial markets of the future, I will absolutely confidently predict. I just don't know when, and I don't know what order. I don't know whether people will get greedy before they get fearful or vice versa. But over the next 30 or 40 years, you'll see some incredible aberrations, and you have to be able to think independently at that time. The U.S. market is 13 or 14 trillion of equities. You know, it's probably close, I haven't looked at the figures lately, but it's close to half the world's market. So you don't really need, unless you got even more money than one share of Berkshire that just gave you, you don't really need the rest of the world to look at. I mean, when you own Coca-Cola, you're having well over 2/3 of your earnings coming from outside the United States, same way with Gillette and all of that. So if you want to expand your universe, there's nothing wrong with it, but the United States will do well over the next 30 or 40 years.
Mr. Buffett, can you give us your general opinion on real estate investment?
Well, real estate, in most, if you're talking about actual direct ownership of real estate, you know, you're talking local markets basically. Now, many people have an advantage in that because they do know their own locale the best. There's nothing magic about any asset category or anything terrible about it. I mean, you know, what do I think about stocks? It depends what stocks, when, what price, all kinds of things. It's the same way with real estate, but I would say that for many people, you know, it is something very understandable for them, and it's something actually where in some cases, if you're on a small scale, sweat equity can do things for you too. People generally own real estate and have it leveraged somewhat so that you get a magnified return plus or minus because you leverage that, and I don't advise leveraging stocks. It's easier to leverage real estate. It's less dangerous. I mean, people look at the property and you can get long-term loans, whereas I regard leverage in stocks as being absolute rat poison. It's probably broken more smart people than anything else, than mistakes in judgment. And I've never used any leverage to speak of. But in real estate, it would be perfectly appropriate in a lot of cases. So I think I think many people would know far more about the real estate they own if they got involved in it directly in their locale, own local area than people often know about the stocks they own or about the investment advisor they're using. So I've done a little in that over the years, not a lot, but I think it's a perfectly fine category, but it gets down to predicting the income stream from the asset and comparing it to the present price. I mean, that's true if you buy oil royalties. It's true of any kind of investment. Investment means laying out money now to get more money later on, and how sure are you of getting that money later on? And if you feel more certain because you know more about the game in real estate than in stocks, then I advise you to stick to your circle of competence is in real estate more than stocks. I mean, you ought to go into the game you know the best.
Mr. Buffett, do you feel that domestic manufacturing concerns, such as the auto industry, will ever be able to successfully compete with foreign producers again?
That's a terrific question. And I may be writing a little something on that very soon. But you know, we have lost our ability to compete in some very major industries. I was in textiles. You know, it was a tough business, and it's gotten tougher since I got out of it. And the truth is, we are not very competitive with a world. You know, our fruit of the loom underwear, maybe, I'm pulling the number out, but it's close. 16,000 out of 20,000 of our employers are working outside the United States. And that production has even moved out of Mexico, where some of it was, to lower cost countries. We're in the shoe business. Americans wear 1.2, or buy, they don't wear, they buy 1.2 billion pairs of shoes a year. That's 4 per capita. To me, that boggles my mind. I buy a pair of shoes about every 10 years. But we're a nation of Imelda Marcoses. I mean, and we're buying shoes like crazy, but we're not making any here anymore. You know, we used to make most of that, of the domestic sales, and now I would say of that billion too, I'd be surprised if more than 50 million pair are made in the United States. That's hundreds of thousands of jobs. You're now seeing it in furniture manufacturing. Our furniture retailers are going over to China primarily, but other parts of the Orient. We're buying, because we buy in big quantities, we can send our people over. We buy that furniture over there, and frankly, you know, in a great many cases, you can't tell the difference, except the difference is in price. So, American consumer is going to vote for good quality, low-priced merchandise. And the auto industry, you know, we are still quite strong in autos. The biggest problem our domestic auto companies have is legacy costs. Back in the 1960s, General Motors was virtually the #1 company in the country, probably was the #1 company in the country, people thought of General Motors being. They had over 50% of the car production. They really just worried about having too much. And they made some contracts back then where they made promises for the future, particularly in post-retirement health as well as pensions, and in health, well, and in pensions at that time too, they didn't have to put the cost through the income account. I mean, it shows you how bad accounting can lead to bad decisions, because they could make these promises to people. If they were an insurance company and made those same promises, they would have had to record the liability. But as an auto company making those promises, they didn't have to record the liability. Choice when the UAW came around, from bargaining tough on wages versus bargaining on giving people something on post-retirement health and pensions. And they gave away the cost. They gave a lot in terms of the cost that wasn't going to count on their current year's income account to avoid some other costs, namely hourly wages, that would count. So they made all of these decisions which started coming home to roost. They came home to roost in terms of the actual payments to be made, plus they changed the accounting rules, so they didn't even get away with it eventually in terms of accounting. They went to pensions first and started recording, and then they went to post-retirement health. So now you have a company like General Motors, where the current management is essentially saddled with running an insurance company, a huge insurance company, with huge health payments, huge pension payments. They've got more people collecting those payments than are actually working for them, and that becomes, you know, that has to go into the cost of a car, and it makes them less competitive with the rest of the world than would otherwise be the case. We try to avoid, if we can, businesses with a very high labor content where that labor could be duplicated elsewhere, because, you know, after 45 years, or whatever it may be, I finally learned something that if somebody else is paying a worker a quarter or a fifth of what we're paying, they're going to kill me, you know, if it's the same product.
Stafford. Mr. Buffett, a decade ago, or not a decade, but a generation ago, people would have careers that went from, you know, maybe 1 or 2 career changes over the span of their lifetime, and then they would retire. My peers and I are looking at almost 8 different career changes, much less job changes, over the course of our career lifetime. How do you think that's affected the workforce in America? Has it had a good impact or a bad impact?
Well, I can just tell you in terms of our own business, I wouldn't want to take any job. I mean, I had jobs in the summer during school and all of that, but I wouldn't want to take a job unless I would be happy having that job, and presumably promotions along the way, but the rest of my life. I mean, I think it is crazy to do a whole bunch of things you don't like with the idea that you're building your resume, or that you're going to 6 job changes later, you're going to finally be in the place where you want to be. I mean, I had a fellow at one school that, as he was taking me to school, he said, you know, I went to undergraduate here, and then I had a job at this auditing firm, and I'm at graduate school, and then I'm going to go. He said maybe it was about 30, 31. He said, I'm now going to thinking of going with a management consulting firm, because I think that would sort of round out my resume. And he said, what do you think? And I said, well, what I think is it sounds like saving up sex for your old age. You know, I mean, you know, when are you going to actually do something you enjoy? You know, it's crazy. So the first thing to do is get a job with somebody that you admire or some company you admire, something you enjoy doing. You may be there the rest of your life, you may not. But you ought to look at it as if you're going to be there the rest of your life. And we have people at Berkshire basically who've devoted their lives to their businesses. Al Yulshi runs flight safety. Al started in 1951 with $10,000. I mean, it's the leading flight training school in the world. Or schools, a lot of campuses, a lot of simulators. And he is doing at 85 or so what he loves doing. And it'd be crazy, presumably you only live once. I mean, Shirley MacLaine may know better, but you don't get the years back. So you ought to be doing what you enjoy. And I think anybody that job hops a lot is missing something in life. And if people are doing it more, I think it's probably a mistake. That doesn't mean you can't change. You're going to get new opportunities, or maybe you find out that that isn't the business you want to be in. But you ought to go in with the intention that you ought to go into a job where you feel like hopping out of bed in the morning, and you can't wait to get down to the office. That's the way I feel still at 73, and I'll feel that way because it's exciting every day. And on the other hand, all kinds of jobs that even if I had no money, I wouldn't take for any price. I really would rather deliver papers or something like that than have a whole bunch of jobs that maybe do things during the day or in the evening that I didn't want to do. It would be crazy if I could pick a figure, if I could make $75,000 a year and have my 12 hours for bridge a week, and I had to give those up in order to make $300,000 a year. I wouldn't do it.
Mr. Buffett, what are the most important qualities you look for in a management team when considering purchasing a company?
The most important qualities, what?
Qualities of a management team when considering purchasing a company.
Well, you want, in a management team, you do want people that love their businesses. I mean, the first thing I look at in buying a business, because usually the people that are selling to me are going to be running it subsequently, not every time, but most of the time. I have to look at them and decide, do they love the money or do they love the business? I would never rely on a contract to keep somebody around. So I'm looking for somebody that's in love with their business. Al Yulshi's in love with his business. I mean, he does it because he likes training people, and he feels he's saving lives, and it's true. I mean, pilot training in this country has improved enormously over the last 50 years. It's safer because pilots are better trained, and he feels good about that. And he feels just as good now as he did 50 years ago about it. He loves the business. He got paid a lot of money for it, but he's not working for money. So I'm looking for management that is doing something they love, and obviously I'm looking for, honest people, but that usually comes with it. I say in essence what we're looking for in managers or employees generally, we're looking for people with intelligence, energy, and integrity. And if they don't have the last one, the first two will kill you. Because if you have somebody without integrity, you don't want them to be smart and energetic. You want them to be dumb and lazy. They won't do much to you if they're dumb and lazy. But if you get those three qualities, and we get them. I mean, we find people like that. If somebody's run a business successfully for 30 years, they're plenty smart at the business. They're energetic. They wouldn't have gotten there otherwise. And the truth is, they wouldn't want to harm that business, whether they own it or not. I mean, it's like one of their children in many cases. I mean, they love it. It's their painting. They created it. So it'd be like slashing the painting, if they did anything to it subsequently. And we've been very lucky in finding those people. I mean, Berkshire is a good home for them, and that fact has been established. And so we get this natural filter through which people come to Berkshire. They see that if for one reason or another they need to do something with their business, that Berkshire is a very good home for it, and it is. But that means we also get some terrific residents of that home.
Mr. Buffett, what are 3 areas or industries where you might initially locate that 1 in 1,000 companies in which you might concentrate heavily?
Well, I would look at things I understood, of course, and I understand insurance. I've been in the business a long time. I understand most financial businesses. I understand certain aspects of retailing. Retailing can be tricky, but I certainly understand that. So I would just look at the things I understood the most. Now, we do things by accident because they come along. I mean, I didn't set out to be in the underwear business a couple years ago. I mean, probably all of you have dreamt all your life of being in the underwear business, but I hadn't thought a lot about it. But Fruit of the Loom was in bankruptcy, and I was very familiar actually with that company in other ways than you might guess. And in fact, I really had become first familiar with it over 45 years earlier. And I understood what was going on it's not a complicated business. You go into Walmart and basically you see, Fruit of the Loom and Hanes. And it had a terrible financial history because they borrowed too much money against it, and it had gotten badly managed for a period, but that was solvable. So I had a mind that was prepared, in effect, with a background that enabled me to understand what was being offered. Then we have a fabulous manager who had earlier run it when it did well, who was willing to come back, John Holland. And I knew with the combination of John Holland, the strength of the brand, the nature of that kind of business, that it was something we would go into. But I didn't have a checklist ahead of time. It came up on the screen, in effect. It came up because somebody borrowed too much money on it. It came up because of a bankruptcy. If they hadn't followed earlier erroneous policies, I never would have seen it. If I couldn't have gotten John Holland to come back and run it, I wouldn't have bought it. Because I mean, what do I know about making underwear? So the key is understanding the industries, and you probably can understand some that I can't, and vice versa. I've been in retailing a lot now. We own a group of furniture businesses, and I think I could probably evaluate another furniture retailer pretty easily after the experiences I have. Plus, I've got a group of 5 great managers, actually, that could tell me a lot about the management of any new one that came along and tell me about the trade position. But I could learn a lot of that myself, too. So I don't have 3 industries in my mind that I'm thinking about now that I want to look at tomorrow. We're buying a company in bankruptcy that essentially sells seismic data. There's a library of seismic data. And they got in trouble because they borrowed too much money and went into a lot of crazy ventures, too. But it's a very sound business. It's not a huge business. But I can understand what the possessor of a library of seismic data can do in terms of selling that information or renting it to people that are interested in drilling in given areas. That wasn't on my radar screen at all until in May or June, the chance to buy actually the whole bond issue and thereby end up probably having the company came along. So you just have to be prepared, and then you have to know what you can know and what you can't know. I mean, you have to really know where that circle of competence is. That's very important. Yeah. Hi.
Katie Russell.
Good to see you.
Mr. Buffett, in petroleum energy investment, which do you prefer, oil refinement, oil services, or oil exploration?
Well, I've been in, when I was at Solomon, we had hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of refining capacity, and it's an interesting, refining is kind of interesting because it always looked like it was going to get tight. It's a commodity business. You don't know what refinery the gas you put in your tank comes from. You don't care. I mean, gas is gas to you. So the only time the refining business is going to be good is when it's tight. Now, one thing that helps to make it tight is people don't build new refineries in this country. It is a tough business, got a lot of environmental problems and all of that. So you would think with oil demand going up over the years and no more refineries being built, that it would get tight at some point. I waited a long time for that point. They have something in that business called capacity creep, which means that you figure out ways to tweak the 200,000 barrel a day refinery so that it does 210 next year or something of the sort. So you have these kind of fuzzy capacity things. So the only time you want to be in the refining business, and I wouldn't want to be in it at all because I wouldn't be trying to time some bump, but is when it's going to be tight. The production business has not been a great business in this country. I mean, you're buying a product You're buying it by drilling in the ground, basically, and incurring various costs. And basically, you sell that product, depending on the life of the field, over maybe an average of 10 years. Well, something that you lay out money for now to get paid money over 10 years, has to bring a big multiple of the price you lay out now. I mean, it's got a long inventory cycle, in effect. I mean, you sell your inventory over a long period. And it's not been a terrible business. If you look at the aggregate record, in fact, this is more offshore, not in the United States, but if you look at Exxon and Royal Dutch and BP and those, they've had a pretty good record in terms of return on capital over time. But Howard Hughes made his money because, he had a very proprietary, or his dad had it originally, a very proprietary product at Hughes Tool. And if you've got something where somebody is spending $100,000, pick a figure, on drilling a well, and you've got a $400 product that's terribly important to the success of the $100,000 product, that's a great position to be in. I mean, you want to look for that all the time, where what you've got is a relatively small piece of some very big project as a whole, but you've got a key piece. And you will not get, that will not be a narrow margin business if you're the only one that's got it. So in oil services, it would depend on the specific type of product I had and how long I thought either the patent on it would last, or that one way or another I could protect that proprietary position. Oil's something we look at. It's a matter of record. We own, we're the third largest holder of PetroChina. PetroChina it produces about 80% as much oil as Exxon. A lot of people never heard of it, but it's producing, 2 million barrels a day, which, close to 3% of the world's output or thereabouts of oil, and it's got a lot of oil. It's a very big company. It was selling at a very low price a year ago. Now, on top of that, oil's going up, and actually China ties their price of oil within their borders to the world price. So its profitability fluctuates with oil prices, but it's a big integrated oil company that is of a size that's not dramatically below the Exxons of the world. And it was selling at a very low multiple. Annual report was perfectly understandable. And so I just read it one day. It's in English, fortunately. It wouldn't have been very good otherwise. But it made as much sense as American annual reports make. And it was at a multiple of earnings that was a huge discount from where other major oil companies sold. And it looked like they were going to use the money as intelligently, as any other oil company. So that's why we ended up buying something like that. The Chinese government owns 90% of it, so it's a little like your B stock in Berkshire. I mean, if I vote with the Chinese government, the two of us control it. But people have made money in refining at certain times. There's a what they call the crack spread, and you can figure it out in terms of what heating oil and gasoline and other things are selling for compared to crude. And when that spread gets wide, refiners are going to make a lot of money. But they don't really have any control over that except when business gets tight. At our textile business, we used to make money for about 10 minutes every year. And the time when we made money, we made linings for men's suits. We made half the linings for men's suits in the country. And nobody ever went into a tailor and said, I'd like a pinstriped gray suit with a Hathaway lining. So it was a terrible business. And we would get voted supplier of the year and all of those things. And then we'd try and raise our prices 1/4 cent a yard, and they said, what's your name? They had no interest in us. So that was a real commodity business. The only time we made any money was when rayon got tight. And because we had an allocation from DuPont, we got X number of pounds. In effect, if rayon got tight, we could raise the price of linings because other people couldn't get rayon then. And it ceased to become a commodity. And then, like I say, about a day later, it would go back to its old form. But that was the whole thing. It wasn't really all this work we did in weaving, all these things, all of those spindles, all of the looms and everything. The money we made was just because of our rayon allocation. And when the rayon allocation was worth money, we made money, and when it wasn't, we didn't make any money. And that's what happens in commodity business. They're brutal. They're wonderful occasionally, but they're brutal. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Mr. Buffett, earlier you talked a lot about your investment philosophies. Could you sum it up and just give us one piece of investment advice, and what would it be the most important? Thank you.
They always want that. I wish I could, there was one thing that would do the job, but I would say those three things that I talked about earlier, if you really get those down into your, into your spinal cord, so that every subsequent decision is processed through that the stock is a business, the market's there to serve you, not to instruct you, and always have a margin of safety. If you have that so that nothing goes through all your mental filters without all of those things coming into play, you won't make any bad investment decisions. But there's no magic. I wish there were, but there can't be, as a practical matter. I mean, I don't believe in fully efficient markets, but they're reasonably efficient most of the time. I mean, you've got a whole lot of smart people trying to make money, and they try very hard, and therefore it's a competitive game. And there can't be any simple little thing except work at it. Now, I will say this, when I got out of school, there were a lot of things around that were extraordinarily cheap. Nobody told me about any of them. I mean, I literally had to go through Moody's Banks and Finance Manual, Industrial Manual, Transportation Manual, Public Utility Manual. Those would probably total 15,000 pages. I turned every page, because nobody was going to tell me some way to find extremely cheap stocks. And I found them by going to it. And if I had small amounts of money, now I would do the same thing with small companies all over again. I mean, that you will find something if you work hard enough at it. Hi.
Sam Clemens. Recently, Fortune magazine ranked you as the most powerful man in business. I was wondering, how do you measure success, and do you even take these rankings into consideration?
Well, I'll give you an answer you may not expect on the success. I mean, by business, if you talk about business success, which I do not regard as the ultimate success, but if you talk about business success, it's running a business successfully over a long period of time, so that you do well, your shareholders do well, and the people who work with you do well. But if you really talk about success as a human being, it's at my age, you are a success if the best test. I've got a friend who was in a concentration camp in Germany, 1942, and she lost a member of the family there. She lives in Omaha now, and she says, and she's in her 70s, she will say to me that in looking at people, the bottom line is, would they hide me? That is the real test. If you've got if you have a lot of people who metaphorically would hide you, at my age, you're going to feel very good about life, and you are a success. And if you've lived a life where nobody would do it, including your own children, including your neighbors, including the people you work with, where they would turn away, you're a failure. I mean, in my view, and I've seen both kinds. And it's the ultimate measure, but you can't buy it. I find that a little irritating. I mean, it'd be so much easier. The only way to be loved is to be lovable. Isn't that terrible? I mean, you can't write a check out for $1 million, like $1 million worth of love. Anyway, I mean, I've got a lot of friends, and some of them that have died now, that everybody loved them. You behaved better around them than you would other people. You took lessons from them, and they all died successes. It's a simple equation, but many people don't learn until too late, or they develop habits that turn other people off, would turn themselves off if somebody else had them, and they don't seem to learn. My old boss, Ben Graham, when he was in his low teens, sat down one day and said to himself, what things do I like in other people? What do I admire in other people? And he wrote them down. And he looked at the list and he said, what is there on this list I couldn't be? isn't the ability to throw a football 60 yards, isn't the ability to, hit a golf ball 300 yards. It's human qualities. Think about who you like and admire. And if you look at those people and you write down what you admire about them, you will find that every one of those qualities you can have yourself. And you can play the reverse side of that. You can write down qualities that you dislike in other people, cause you to really avoid them. You don't want to be associated with them. And if you write those down, if you have those qualities, people are going to feel the same way about you. Now, it's very tough to choose when you're 60 or 70. I mean, it's that line, the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. So whatever habits you're developing now, you're going to have at some later date. But you can have the habits of the people you admire and get rid of the habits of the people that you feel badly about at your age. That's why I like to talk to students. I don't really talk to other groups. If I talk to a bunch of guys my age, they want to be entertained or they want predictions. But students, you can be whatever you want to be, from this age forward. And the truth is, when you get to be 70, what you'll care about is who loves you. See how this works. I've never had one of these before, but we got it? Something like that. Anyway, what I would like to do is if the students will, Casey Stengel said one time to the baseball team, I got this straight? Is that about it? Okay. Casey Stengel said one time to the baseball team, line up alphabetically by height.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Clayton Family Foundation and by Clayton Homes, building affordable homes for families and individuals throughout the United States. To order a copy of Vintage Buffett, Warren Buffett Shares His Wealth on VHS tape, call 1-800-733-8657.